Again, welcome everybody, and it's nice to see you all here at this time of COVID Zooms and out of TBS. While we're all establishing social distancing, but still staying socially networked and connected. That's a delightful ability that we've been given here. I guess in the spirit of Jewish humor, which is always the best defense at times like this, I'd note that for anybody who is stockpiling 144 rolls of toilet paper, you could instead simply buy one box of matzah, and it will solve the whole problem. Cue the rim shot, and enough of that, or as they say, dayenu. Yes, indeed, Passover is coming, and this week in the synagogue we would have in our Torah reading marked it as a special Shabbat, not just because of the unusual format that we're following these days, but because it is Shabbat HaChodesh, one of the four Shabbatot that prepare us for Passover. And as such, the Torah's double portion, which is Vayakel Pekudei, the last part of the book of Exodus, is followed by a special maftir from Exodus 12, which begins with the words, HaChodesh hazeh yeh lachem rosh chodashim. This month will be to you the first of months. That's where we get the name Shabbat HaChodesh, HaChodesh hazeh, this month being Nisan, the month in which we will celebrate Passover, and Nisan begins this coming Thursday. So with that in mind, I want to focus on one line from the special Torah reading. And after explaining the Passover offering, which is the roasted lamb and the matzah and bitter herbs, the text goes on to say this in Exodus 12. And there we go. V'chacha tochlu oto, matnechem chagurim, nalechem beraglechem, umakelchem biyedchem, v'achaltem oto b'chipazon, pesach hu l'Adonai. I don't know if we can unmute Alvin. Maybe he can chant it from memory. Alvin, can you unmute and chant it? You're not unmuted.
Now I am.
Okay.
V'kacha tochlu oto, matnechem chagurim, nalechem beraglechem, umekalchem biyedchem, v'achaltem oto b'chipazon, pesach hu l'Adonai.
Okay.
Memory.
There you go. So that's the verse. This is how you shall eat it: your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, your staff in your hand, hurriedly. That's the way it's to be eaten. That was it. That was the Seder. That was the whole Seder. That's the way it was carried out for centuries, for years. That's the way it was done. Pesach matzah maror, eaten hurriedly, dress up part, cloak, sandals, staff. They were not always emphasized down through the ages, but we do have evidence from various ancient texts going back to the 3rd century BCE. There's a text by a Greek poet named Ezekiel, not to be confused with the 6th century prophet Ezekiel from the Bible, but a poet who documents that this is the way Pesach was being observed. And in fact, the Samaritans began to observe it that way, and to this very day gather outside of what is today called Nablus, what is in the Bible called Shechem, and there on Mount Gerizim they gather, they offer a lamb, or they roast a lamb, eat it with bitter herbs and matzah, dressed up with their cloaks and their staffs and the sandals on their feet. Very different from the way that we celebrate our Seder, very different from the way that we celebrate Passover today. The Seder that we're familiar with, the text of the Haggadah that we're familiar with, first begin to take shape at the time of the Mishnah, and which is codified in the 2nd, or actually the 3rd century of the Common Era. And the first text of a Haggadah that we actually have is from the 8th century of the Common Era. So you can see that there's been a long period of development. Now, as I said, we all know that our seders are very different today. We sit at a lavishly set table, and according to tradition, we recline at certain times as we eat certain of the ritual items. Some people bring pillows to the table. That's because they may fall asleep during the Seder. But the ritual, as it was described in the book of Exodus, is so radically different. And I wonder, what impression would it create? What theme of the Exodus experience would it emphasize? How would you describe people dressed that way? Cloaks, sandals, walking sticks. What does that look like? So if you would like to respond, do you know how to do the raise your hand piece? That if you go down to where it says participants in the bottom of your screen, you can bring it up alongside, and there's a mechanism down at the bottom right which says raise your hand. So if you want to raise your hand, maybe somebody wants to respond to that. What's your impression of a Seder that's conducted in that way, with a staff in your hand and your cloak on and your sandals on your feet? What's being emphasized there? I see people talking, but I can't hear a soul.
Rabbi, you have a couple of hands here. So Barry and Charles and Alvin all raised their hands. So I'm just going to go down the order here, okay, and unmute people for you, okay? Here we go.
Okay,
Barry.
Go ahead.
Barry,
So,
you're up.
I'm unmuted, but at first it reminded me of Jesus, but actually it's really Moses.
Okay, Moses, that's the image that we have of Moses dressed, wandering through the wilderness, right? Being followed by people similarly dressed. Anyone else want to comment on it?
All right, Charles, you're up.
On the run, you're escaping.
That's right, escaping, on the run, literally on the run. Good. Anyone else?
Alvin, you're up. Alvin, I unmuted you.
Okay, so I guess Alvin doesn't want to comment.
I do.
Well, now, there he is.
There we go.
Now
It was,
I got him
yeah.
up.
So it's sort of like going on a hike. Substitute hiking shoes for the sandals, but the walking sticks that we carry, and having our backpack on instead of maybe the cloak. But it's that idea of going on a long trek, being all prepared with your supplies and ready to walk for a long distance.
Okay, so I mean that makes it sound like a sort of a enjoyable spazier in the hiking of the mountains that you go to for a vacation or something like that. But it's really, of course, the image of flight, the image of being rushed to run for your life in some way. And it's very appropriate then that this is the special Torah reading that we would be having for this refugee Shabbat, what was to have been Hias's refugee Shabbat, with hundreds of congregations participating around the country. A Shabbat to reflect on the situation of refugees. And to think about that experience, most of us have not had that experience, that need to flee in haste, thank God. But to think about it is to recognize that it was not an uncommon experience in Jewish history, not just at the time of the Exodus from Egypt, but throughout Jewish history. That experience of being forced to flee, to make a run for it, to become a refugee, and ultimately, hopefully, an immigrant to a land of greater promise or a promised land. With that in mind, I invited a very good friend, Zoltan Turi, to be with us today to share his experience, his refugee experience. Now, just a word of introduction about Zoltan. I met Zoltan a number of years ago, actually through Bernie Platt, at a time that Zoltan's father had passed away. And we were meeting to talk about that. And at the same time, at that particular time in my life, I was preparing to lead a group of rabbis from JFNA, the Jewish Federation of North America, on an Eastern European trip, and particularly to Budapest. We went to Budapest, or we were going to go to Budapest to explore what was going on with the Jewish community there, And after I heard Zoltan's story, I asked him if he would be willing to share that story with this group of rabbis before we left on our trip, maybe to meet us at the airport and tell us the story before we went off to Budapest. He said no, he would not do that. Instead, he would meet us in Budapest to tell that story. And he did. And he did it again with the first TBS trip to Eastern Europe. And he did it again with the second TBS trip to Eastern Europe. And he came to help prepare our groups before we go. And I can never thank him enough for doing all of that. But what I keep doing is turning back to him and asking him again and again to help me with various projects. And this is another one of them. Zoltan, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay, nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
So Zoltan, I'm not going to interview you, but we'll maybe have some questions for you afterwards, or I might interrupt you if I can't resist as you go along. But tell us the story.
Sure. So I brought a prop along, and you were talking about hiking boots. So here is my 7-year-old's. I don't know how well you can see it, but I still have it. Those are the boots that we went hiking with, and I'll tell you the hike story. I always tell Rabbi Lindemann that my story is a pretty modest one compared to what people suffered through and went through in that part of the world, but I'm happy to share it with you. So I was born, you can do the math, I was born in 1949 in Budapest. And as a little background, Hungary was at the vanguard of anti-Semitic laws and fascist governments, in their case, starting in 1920. And that's the environment in which my parents grew up. They were born in 17 and 18. And I was born in 49, and by that time, a long, dark period for Jews in Hungary had passed. My parents were married in the main synagogue of Budapest, and many members of the shul have been there, and survived the Second World War with great difficulty. And the Second World War, for those who survived, the Jews who survived, segued into a communist dictatorship, a different kind of police state, but one that used the same facilities as the Gestapo had used. And Stalin was in charge still. He was still alive, and so that's the environment in which I was born into in 49. Despite which I had a very happy childhood. I had my parents around. We were 4 people living in an apartment in the middle of Budapest, and that was my parents. And ironically, for a communist country, it was actually very easy for a middle-class family to have a full-time nanny and maid and live in person. And that was a young woman named Anna who had come up from a small village, and she was like my second mother. So everything was pretty good for a 7-year-old until October 23rd of 1956. It was a Tuesday, and I woke up ready to go to school, and there was a sound that if you've ever heard it, even if you were 7, you would remember quite clearly. It's the sound of automatic weapons fire echoing through an inner city, and that went on for quite some time. They got the children down on the floor in the building and down into the basement, where we spent the next several days while there was a revolution that had broken out that basically was very temporarily successful. For about 2 weeks, the Soviets withdrew, and so it was a temporary reprieve. There wasn't much food, but down in that basement, we were lucky enough to have had a bakery in the underground floor. A bakery in Hungary in the communist, Orthodox communist state was not a patisserie. It was they made bread and biscuits. Happily, they also made cookies, and there were enough cookies to feed the kids down in the basement, which for a 7-year-old was a gourmet meal every day. And then life resumed. I never went back to school. And the Russians came back in force with tens of thousands of soldiers and tanks, and They put down the revolution, which was really started by kids, by university students, and who were joined by laborers and renegade segments of the Hungarian army. And that went on, the fighting went on mostly outside Budapest for a couple of months, actually. A lot of people were killed. And there was a period during which people who wanted to get out of Hungary, who wanted to get away from a police state, in my case of my parents, they had suffered really under both, had the thought of getting out to the West. And there was a conscious decision by the provisional government there to leave civilians alone until they got the fighting done. Steve, am I roughly going along the lines of what you want? Because I was going to segue then into how we got out. I can't hear you, I'm sorry. Steve, you're muted.
Okay, now I'm unmuted. This is exactly what I expected, Zoltan. So keep going. But I didn't. The prop. Hold up the prop again at some point. This is the boot that you actually wore when you escaped. I never had seen that. Both boots.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's hard to see because the camera foreshortens. They're little child's boots. Unfortunately, my parents and I have never thrown anything away, so I have a treasure. 7-year-olds are really much more aware of their environment than people give them credit for. And I was aware that, we were home all day because we didn't have school. So a little like what we have here, but I could tell they were whispering and talking to each other and talking to family and talking to friends. And I had learned in a police state, even elementary school students know not to say anything to strangers or anybody else. But I became fairly aware by early December that they were planning to try to make an escape. And I was quiet about it, or more or less quiet. It's important to note that every business, every office, every apartment building, every unit of any kind had secret police watchers, and they were back, of course, after the revolution had failed. So I didn't tell anybody except my little best friend Agnes, who was the little 7-year-old girl whom I played with every day. And on December 4th of 1956, I told her that I thought we were probably going to try to escape tonight. And as I learned many years later, she didn't tell anybody except her mom. And as it turns out, her mom was the secret police watcher in the building. And as I learned many years later, her mom did absolutely nothing with that information. So that night, they woke me up around 1 or 2 in the morning. They told me we were leaving, and that the official story, if anybody asked, is that we were going to visit family in the countryside, which of course we didn't have. There was a curfew, and the revolution had been put down only a couple of weeks before. So you couldn't be outside. That was something for which you could get shot. And so we went down to the lobby, and in the lobby was waiting a young man who had been paid to take us. He had a truck parked in an alley outside. We ran to the truck. Again, this was middle of the night. My dad sat up front as though he belonged there, and my mom and I and Anna hid under burlap in the back of the truck. And that took us to the main railroad station. Once you were at the railroad station, then you weren't violating the curfew. There were trains running. And my dad got his train tickets, and the 4 of us set off. And it was a long day of travel, but eventually we wound up in a town on the western part of Hungary called Kapuvar, about 20 kilometers from the border. And there was a pediatrician. Word of mouth had gotten back that there was a pediatrician who would help us. And indeed he did. We slept in a room in that hospital that night. And then the next day, which was December 5th, really began our tiny exodus. I remember that they got my parents, and all 4 of us were in there, so Anna and I as well. And they showed us maps. They had maps of the escape routes, and there were 2. One was a 19-kilometer hike, but there were a lot of pins and little flags there showing where troops were gathered. And that was a relatively flat, straight road. And there was a 26-kilometer hike through the woods that had fewer patrols and fewer encampments. But it was much more hilly. And remember, this was December. There was snow on the ground. It was fairly miserable. It was cold. My parents chose the 26-kilometer hike. That's about 17 miles, give or take. And we stayed in the hospital the rest of that day. Anna, who was like my mom in many ways, had to decide whether she was going to join us or not. She really was part of the family. Ultimately, during a very long crying session, she decided that as someone who had no education, she was worried she'd be a burden to us, and it made sense for her to stay. As Stephen knows, my dad had this little speech he gave her, which is, when we get out, if we have a loaf of bread, we will always slice it in 4 equal parts. But she stayed behind, and I'm sorry, it still makes me tearful. So the three of, and we made arrangements so that if we got over the border, we left her money to give the guide, half the money that we were going to give our guide. Our guide was a farmer. He showed up at the hospital. We walked to his house, where we stayed and waited until sunset. And then we set off on the night of December 5th. As I said, it was 26 kilometers. We started out to the edge of town, where we sheltered underneath an overpass. And I remember trucks going by and my parents telling me to be very quiet. And then we headed out in the dark. And the farmer knew the territory well. It was a little complicated by the fact that he was very drunk. He walked us at one point to the edge of a road where we lay in a ditch because convoys were passing by. And as a convoy passed by, he had us run across. We could see the lights of another group of vehicles, but they were in the distance. And we ran to a barn, and we flattened ourselves against the barn as the convoy passed. And then we began this long hike over through fields and forest. And at one point, which I remember, and again, I was 7, but this is really crystal clear. We had to lie flat in a field as a patrol passed by. And I had been told to be very quiet, but I was 7. And at some point, and we could hear the patrol, I spoke up. I said something, and a little child's voice, echoes in a quiet field in December in Hungary. And the soldiers undoubtedly heard me, and they recognized it was a child's voice, and they just pretended they didn't hear. They just continued on. I still feel guilty about it, all this many years later. In any event, we walked through kind of an endless set of hills, and eventually, the farmer kept saying, "Don't worry, it's just around the bend," which it wasn't. And eventually we got to a clearing, and the clearing was a field which led to, so we were at the edge of the woods in a clearing that led to a canal, which happened to be the border between Austria and Hungary. Between May and October of that year, totally fortuitously, the mines had been lifted in most places, not everywhere. And I don't want to make the story any longer. There were reasons for that, but in any event, we didn't have to run across a minefield. And we saw a light flashing in the distance, which was a signal not just to our guide, but to apparently other people in the woods, because we didn't realize that. Everybody had been pretty quiet. And all of a sudden, I seem to remember about 10 or 15 people ran out of the woods, all toward the flashlight. This was a canal. There was a canal barge that had been turned perpendicular for this purpose. And we ran down the edge of an embankment down into the canal, and then up the side of the boat, which had some kind of a ladder. And we ran across the boat, and then down the other side, and once again up the embankment. My father paid the guide the half of what we owed him, and gave him the code word so Anna would release the other half. And I remember my dad just standing there, because there was a big Austrian flag, which is red, white, and red. And I remember him just sighing. And then we ran again to the other side of a little hill so that although nobody was firing at us, that we'd be out of the line of fire. Then we sat down in a field, which was wet and cold. And we waited, and the Jeep came by with a big red cross on it, and a soldier. And we got driven into a little town, as a village, maybe 100, 200 people named Wallern. And they put all these refugees, a couple of dozen of us, eventually into this barn where, again, I was with my parents. And although this sounds scary or potentially dangerous, which it was actually okay because I was with my parents. And I mentioned that just as a kind of reminder that we're not treating refugees quite the same way in terms of children. I think being with my parents made the whole experience really enormously more secure for a little child. In any event, so we slept in that barn for a couple hours. And in the morning, we woke up to the fact that it was December 6th and we were no longer in a police state. The villagers there were just wonderful people. And December 6th, for those who might know it, is St. Nicholas's Day in that part of the world that is largely Christian, Catholic, partly because all the Jews, including part of my family, have been killed. December 6th was the day that they gave the presents and candy to children and so on, not December 25th. And the local villagers brought us chocolate. I can taste that chocolate. Chocolate was a consumer good that communist states didn't share with the people. It was a bourgeois luxury, so I had never had chocolate like that. And that's what sticks in a 7-year-old's mind. And we stayed there for about a day when a bus came and picked up the refugees and took us to the first of several refugee camps that we lived in. Stephen, am I still doing okay? You have to signal because you muted.
There we go. Yes, you're definitely doing okay.
Okay, so then they bused us. My parents were afraid they were going to bus us back to Hungary. People who lived through the Nazis and the communists didn't trust anything, and actually to get from that little village to the rest of Austria, you had to turn east. And so that scared them a little bit, but no. They took us, the first camp was Ried-im-Innkreis. It was like the barracks. They actually, the Austrians were very kind. They had just been released from the four-state rule that Germany was under until 1989. So there had been a joint four powers agreement to make Austria neutral. And I think the Austrians were grateful that they were no longer part of the Russian zone anymore, and they were really nice to us. Anyway, they took us to this camp, and they let us walk into town. We walked into town, mind you. We had no money. Hungarian currency was worthless, and we'd left it all with the guide anyway. And we walked into a little grocery store, which had things like oranges and bananas and things I had never seen before. And they had raisins, and I wanted some raisins, and we had no money. And my parents explained that to me, and some villager saw what was going on and put a shilling in my hand, an Austrian shilling. And my parents were just horrified. My parents were scientists. They'd been middle-class people 48 hours before, and now they felt like they were beggars. And in fact, we stayed in that camp until we got some money, which came from my aunt, my father's sister in New York, who sent us $50. And we made that last for several months, actually. And so we were able to go to Vienna, where we were able to stay in a little hotel and basically wait for our papers. And again, the Austrians were very kind to us. We traveled for free. We had little ID documents, but nobody ever asked to look at them because we all looked shabby and underfed. We basically had help from HIAS and the Joint Distribution Committee and the Red Cross, to which I recommend donating as well. And eventually we wound up in a camp outside Salzburg in Western Austria. Not such a nice place. I turned 8 in that camp. There were barracks that were housing Hungarian Jewish refugees, but they were also housing displaced persons who were under arrest. They were Nazis who had fled with the Germans out of occupied countries, including Hungary, knowing they'd be killed if they stayed behind as the Germans withdrew. So the camp was scary. At some point, my parents decided they had to get out of there, and they made arrangements for a car to take us into Salzburg. When that car came up, we walked to the car with basically these primarily Hungarian Nazis throwing rocks at us. One of them punched my dad, but we got out of there. And we stayed under fairly difficult circumstances in Salzburg. I remember soup kitchens as our primary source of nourishment. And then one day, they came for us, and they put us, they being the refugee agencies, and they put us on a train. And that train spent the day going across Germany, going north to Bremenhaven, which was the primary port in the American sector. And we got to the ship, and the ship was the General Leroy Eltinge, which was a World War I era troop transport. And several thousand Hungarians got on the ship, and we all stood at the guardrails looking down, and an American Army band came, and they played the Hungarian anthem, which everybody knew. And then they played this piece of music that most of us had never heard before, and that was the Star Spangled Banner. It was a nice touch. And then we set sail on an 11-day trip in January across the North Atlantic. And I know that there are no cruises going anymore, but that's one I wouldn't recommend, even in a large cruise ship under no health crisis going on. North Atlantic in January is very rough. It was particularly rough, that one, to the extent there's been a movie made about that storm that we went through. Of the 11 days, I stopped throwing up after 6, which made me something of a hero as a kid. You have to understand, these were thousands of people who had been locked into a landlocked country for generations, really. And so nobody had any sea legs whatsoever. Because I had turned 8, I was housed with the men, and basically those are the standard troop transport deals. So triple bunk beds with several hundred people in several hundred men in a single room with the ship rocking like crazy. My dad slept in the cot above me and left his arm hanging down so I could feel secure by grabbing his hand during the night. And I had a dream, and the dream was that when we got to America, all my little new second grade schoolmates would speak Hungarian. I remember the dream well, and it didn't pan out. In any event, after 11 days, and this is sort of movie worthy, and my dad woke me up and took me up on deck in the early morning hours, and what looked like an 18-foot tall sailor picked me up, and I saw the Statue of Liberty, which I also remember very well. And we pulled into Brooklyn Harbor. Ellis Island had closed in 1955, and they took us by bus. We were bus number 35 to Camp Kilmer, which was they reopened an army camp which was in Piscataway, the property that I think now belongs to Rutgers. And we spent about 3 days there. I have one more prop, Stephen. I don't know if that's visible. They gave us this there, United States Escapee Program. If you look it up, it turns out that it was a CIA front, never mind. Because they had a thinly veiled effort to see if any of these people had useful information about this Eastern Bloc country there. But in any event, and we spent 3 days there. Now, we didn't speak English. My dad knew a few words. And we went to the mess tent. And on the first day we were there, and they served us breakfast on the chow line. Most of us had a very tough crossing, so we needed the nourishment. And the poor, I don't know, some private who was probably on KP duty served us the eggs, and he had a little tag, like they all do, and with the name. And this happened to be a private Snow, S-N-O-W. And my father explained to my mother how courteous the Americans were because they put the weather on their shirts. In any event, after 3 days, my aunt and uncle picked us up and took us to Brooklyn, where they lived. My uncle was a neuropathologist. His story is interesting, but I won't digress. And we lived in Brooklyn with them for a little while. And after a week or two, they put me in PS 39 in Brooklyn. I didn't speak a word of English. And we spent, I would say, the next 3 years were incredibly difficult. My parents were both PhDs. They didn't speak the language, and they had menial jobs. We lived in various flop houses, and at some point we moved to Newark, New Jersey, and lived in an area that even then wasn't very good, and slept on the floor because we didn't have the money for a fan, and it was at that time summertime. But after and this image that somehow refugees just kind of show up and they are thrilled to be in a free country and the land of plenty and life is easy is a myth. It wasn't. But after about 3 years, everybody acculturated, everybody basically began to meld into society. My parents eventually did extremely well, and I was treated, I went through elementary school and high school and got the chance to compete on an equal ground with people who'd been born here, which was a unique present from the United States in that era. Mind you, if you read the politics, people felt that we were all communist plants and that we were going to subvert the state. And we weren't given residency papers for 9 years until 1965. When I was a junior in Livingston High School in Livingston, New Jersey, they sent 2 FBI guys to my high school to talk to the principal to make sure I wasn't a communist organizer. So the McCarthy era had not faded yet. But that kind of in a sum, Stephen, is my refugee story.
I've heard it before, parts of it. I haven't really even heard all of it. There are things you added today and of course some of the props that I wasn't aware of at all. And I am awed by your story. It's amazing to hear. It opens, I think, a window through which we can see and maybe sense a little bit of what that word refugee means, which we bandy about today in so many ways. And every refugee has a story. I think that we now, at the remove of so many years of having, from the time when there were many Jewish refugees, although it wasn't that too far, back in history, that there were many Jews coming to this country from the Soviet Union who were indeed refugees as well. I don't think their stories, I don't think many of them were quite as harrowing as yours, but indeed there were some very dramatic stories that were part of that. And I thank you so much for sharing it with us. I assume that some people may want to ask a few questions. I don't have a lot of time for questions, but I think that I see a hand up already. Barry's hand is up, I can see. But if you'll bear with us, Zoltan, maybe you'll take a couple of questions.
Yeah, give me 1 quick second to set up. And okay. And all right, so if you raise your hand, I'll be able to unmute you. All right, here we go. Okay, you're up.
I'm up?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Quick question with Dr. Turi. I remember I was on a trip 4 years ago, and we flew there, and tell me what happened to Anna.
Yeah, so Anna was my other mom, really. Anna died in 2014, actually. It's 6 years. She died, you guys were there, and she died not that much longer later. She had a stroke. And she was 85. Her son was coming over for lunch and found her. I went over actually and saw healthcare in Hungary, and 2014, it wasn't a pretty picture, and unfortunately she died. She waved to you guys, as I recall. Yeah.
Another question?
Barry looks like he's raising his hand there.
Yeah, I don't know if we can get to him. Alex, can we get to him?
I don't see a hand raised, so I'm not sure who's.
It's Barry Wexler.
Yeah, hold on.
If
One
we,
sec. I'm not seeing
he's
his.
physically raising his hands.
Yeah, if you all actually put it on the screen, then it comes to the top and I'm able to unmute you very quickly. All right, Barry, you're up.
I have two quick questions. One is, have you put this into writing, or have you considered publishing it? And my second question is, what would have happened if you had during your exodus had been forced back to Hungary? What would they have done with you?
So it was a matter of luck. The people who were lucky were shipped back to wherever they had come from, Budapest. And they had some hardships that went with it. If they were lucky, they were sort of considered potential enemies of the state, but allowed to keep working and so on. Some people were shipped off to labor camps, and some were never heard from again. And an unlucky relative minority were probably shot. It's unclear. The uprising caught the Soviet Union by surprise, and the fact that so many people were so unhappy. And I think they were probably more lenient than they might have otherwise been. It wasn't a good thing. We heard about people who actually made a second try and succeeded. So this was not the Gestapo era where they shot you. Or, as you may know, in '89, a large part of the reason why the communist bloc, the satellite bloc, fell was because I think an East German had tried to make a run from Hungary across the border and had been shot and killed. And the Hungarian foreign minister said that will never happen again. That was in '89. And when they heard that, enormous convoys of East Germans and Poles and Czechs and so on came to the Hungarian border, abandoned their cars and walked across. And that kind of was the end of the Soviet bloc. So Hungary had a tradition, and it started then, that they weren't necessarily killing people for trying to escape. It was a little bit of luck as to what kind of patrols you encountered. So if it was the Soviets or the Hungarians who were loyal to the Soviets, that was not so good. If you were encountered by Hungarians who were renegades or the freedom fighters, who were mostly young kids and not anywhere near where we were, that would have been good news. But in any event, we would have been, there's a reasonable chance we would have been okay, but there's also a chance that we would not have. You had another question, I'm sorry.
Hold on.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm unmuted. The other question was, have you considered putting this down in some way?
For my son, I would like to do it. Again, I don't think, there's more to the story. And for those of you who've heard my little presentation, I try to put it in context of what was going on in Eastern Europe and what the history of Hungary was. And so many people have such, I believe, more compelling and more difficult stories. I think my family's history is interesting, but I'm not sure mine is worthy of anything more than what we're doing today. And even that, I always tell Rabbi Lindemann that I'm happy to share it, but I find it almost embarrassing in the sense that people went through so much more than I did. As I said, I had a happy childhood up until everything ended on October 23rd, 56.
Go ahead, Alex, maybe we'll take one more question.
Yeah, I'm trying to unmute the Vasquez. It's not letting me.
Can you hear me
Here we
now?
go. Yes.
Now we can hear you. Sorry.
First of all, Susan, I want to thank you for telling a very compelling story. A couple of questions that we had regard two things. One is, prior to the communists taking over in Hungary, how did your parents fare in Budapest under the Nazis? How did they manage to live through that? And the second thing that I had a question about also was in the acculturation, did you have any special programs that were given to you in terms of learning English or were you kind of just thrown into the mix, as it were?
So I'll share the second.
Before you respond, I want to take care of one housekeeping matter with Alex. Alex, how long can we hold this line?
I will look that up while you're talking.
Okay, go ahead. Zoltan?
We're trying to do the same thing for the hospital, and Zoom is really terrific. One version only gives you 40 minutes, and the other, I'm not sure, but.
Oh, we have plenty of time. It's just if another group jumps on this line. So keep talking. I just have to look it up.
Okay, so for the second one, I wound up in second grade in Far Rockaway, Queens. And they had 5 sections of the second grade. So section 5 or 2-5 was for the people who were intellectually challenged and they had, various and sundry reasons why they couldn't be mainstreamed. So they put me in that class, along with my lifelong friend Peter Levine. He was 2 years too young for the class, and I didn't speak English. And they sent me to speech therapy, which didn't make any sense. But ironically, the first day of medical school in 1970, Peter Levine and I met again. We had both gone from class 2-5 to the same medical school class at Columbia. So anyway, no, the answer to that part is we were just forced to, it was just forced assimilation, and kids pick up stuff very easily. By third grade, I represented my school in the spelling bee. We didn't make it very far because I was paired with a little girl. My word was surgeon, and her word was wall, W-A-L-L, and she missed that one. So I got surgeon, and so that didn't work out. But anyway, with regard to my parents, they were married in 1941 in the beautiful main synagogue there. Hungary, because it was allied with the Germans, was not invaded by the Germans until 1944. And it was really Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia, where Hitler essentially forced his allies into sending soldiers, that really changed life in Hungary for the non-Jews. The Jews were put into slave labor camps fairly early, including my dad. The slave labor camps had a huge attrition rate. Most of the people in that slave labor camp were killed or died working. My dad escaped before they essentially exterminated the camp. And he was in hiding in Budapest. I know a lot less about my mom, who didn't talk about it and took whatever she went through to the grave with her. And my dad actually didn't talk about this until very late in his life. But they survived. And the Germans came in, and Eichmann came in March of 1944. And then they systematically began sending Jews out to Auschwitz primarily. My grandfather was sent to Mauthausen, which is the Austrian-German border. And he was eventually put into a camp where they basically, it wasn't an extermination camp, it was a work camp, and they just didn't feed people, so they all died. That camp was liberated in early 1945 with a particular company that liberated the camp was run by a fellow named Westmoreland, who got to be famous later on. My grandfather died a few days after the camp was liberated. He was 56 years old, and we know this because they kept records. So the people, they found a lot of bodies with no identification, but the people who survived and died the next few days were all buried in a mass grave of 1,036 people in the little town of Wels, Austria. And so I go there every so many years. And of course, no one knew anything. So when he didn't come back, my mother eventually figured out he died. And there were some records that they were really not able to find that out until 56 when we were in Austria, and not able to visit until 65 when we went back. My parents survived it. And then My dad finished his PhD, and Hungary for about 3 years was nominally not a communist dictatorship. So they both went to work and kind of their lives resumed. And then it became a communist dictatorship in 48 and then kind of a nasty police state. And there are many more stories to tell, but that kind of sums it up. Can I'd say one more thing, Stephen, if it's okay. It's a vignette. On that boat, I got a little blue packet, much smaller than the escapee program thing. And it had little items like a comb and a toothbrush and a card from an elementary school class in Illinois. Just little things. And it wasn't the things, it was the thought behind it. It was an incredible treasure to this day. If I find that card, because it's unlikely we ever threw it out, I'm going to try to see if I can find those little kids from the elementary school class who sent something. I mention this only because there are a lot of refugees out there, and anything you all want to do for them is going to be appreciated.
Well, Rabbi, you need to unmute yourself. Here you go.
There we go. Now I'm unmuted. So first of all, Zoltan, I can't thank you enough for once again coming to my rescue and presenting something that's so moving and so important and so unique, and doing it in your own humble and gentle way. And I hope that I only hope that I get to call you again and make you again drop everything from the middle of a workday. And I know you're a busy working physician, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate your willingness to be with us and to share all of that. It was my intention at the end of this to go back to look at some additional text from the Haggadah, where these themes of flight are picked up again, whether it's in the Arami Oved Avi, the central discussion point of the Haggadah, where we're told that our ancestor was a wandering Aramean, or whether it's in the section about matzah, matzah zhu she'anu ochlim al shumah. Why do we eat this matzah? We eat it because it is a reminder of our ancestors' flight when they didn't have time to let the dough rise. And Alex is popping some of this onto the screen right there. And of course, those who were on yesterday for Cantor Cohen's wonderful discussion of Halach Ma'anya, where we, at the very beginning of the Seder, say, this is the bread of our, which our ancestors ate. All who are hungry, let them come and eat. All in need, let them come and share with us. A time when once before it was popular to open the door at the end of the Seder for Elijah, a time when one opened the door was at the beginning of the Seder to invite people in. The idea of an open door is such an important one. And I always think of the lady who holds her lamp that you saw, Zoltan, beside what was meant to be an open door. I lift my arms beside the golden door. You know, it's an amazing story, and so much a part of our past, so much a part of our tradition, so much a part of the Seder if we make it so. One of my favorite Haggadahs is a Haggadah called A Night to Remember, and in that Haggadah there's a poem. It's a poem by Marge Percy, and you see it up there on the screen. And I'm going to read it for those who might find it a bit difficult to see it. The courage to let go of the door, the handle, the courage to shed the familiar walls whose very stains and leaks are comfortable as the little moles of the upper arm, stains that recall a feast, a child's naughtiness, a loud battering storm, the slap of the roof hard, pouring through. The courage to abandon the graves dug in the hill, the small bones of children, the brittle bones of the old whose marrow hunger had stolen, the courage to desert the tree planted and only begun to bear, the riverside where promises were shaped, the streets where empty pots were broken, the courage to leave the place whose language you learned as early as your own, whose customs, however dangerous or demanding, bind you like a halter you have learned to pull inside, to move your load. The land fertile with the blood spilled on it, the roads mapped and annotated for survival. The courage to walk out of the pain that is known into the pain that cannot be imagined, mapless, walking into the wilderness, going barefoot with a canteen into the desert, stuffed in the stinking hold of a rotting ship, sailing off the map into dragons' mouths. Cathay, India, Siberia, Golden Medina, leaving bodies by the way like abandoned treasures. So they walked out of Egypt, so they bribed their way out of Russia under loads of straw, so they steamed out of the bloody, smoking charnel houses of Europe on overloaded freighters, forbidden all ports. Out of pain into death or freedom, or a different painful dignity into squalor and politics, we Jews are all born of wanderers, with shoes under our pillows, and a memory of blood that is ours raining down. We honor only those Jews who changed tonight, those who chose the desert over bondage, who walked into the strange and became strangers and gave birth to children who could look down on them standing on their shoulders for having been slaves. We honor those who let go of everything but freedom, who ran, who revolted, who fought, who became other by saving themselves. Where in this poem do you find the story of your parents or grandparents or great-grandparents? What line, what word resonates in your heart? This was to have been Refugee Shabbat, and we find ourselves instead staring at a screen, but really looking to each other to share in a wonderful story shared with us by Zoltan, and to think about what Passover would and should mean. There are many commentaries, the commentary of Ralbag in the 13th, 14th century, the commentary of Malbam in the 19th century, which tell us that the words that we read in the Torah, that you should flee with your sandals on your feet and your staff in your hand, and that's the way you should celebrate Passover, to remember that. There are commentaries which tell us, well, that's all left behind now. And in fact, we do just the opposite. We're supposed to loosen our shoes, loosen our belts, sit at the table comfortably. But at the same time, we're supposed to experience those moments of discomfort. And all of that to make us conscious that this is to have been Refugee Shabbat. This is the definition that Highest distributes of refugees. There are 70 million displaced people in the world today. This year, our country was to have admitted 18,000, an interesting number in itself, and what that number 18 represents in Jewish life. And of course, that's not going to happen because everything is locked down right now. But we'll come out of this, and even while we're in it, we should probably take a moment to think about those who are in camps right now, waiting to get out and come to this country. Remarkable story. Mark Hetfield, the director of Highest, said, we used to help refugees because they were Jewish. Now we help them because we're Jewish. I hope that you'll go on the highest website, that you'll find a way that you can help, even in these difficult times, and that you will take some of this to your Seder with you eventually. And again, thank you, Zoltan, so much for being with us. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And thank you, Alex, for your technical help in making it all work. Take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay well, stay in touch. Bye.